Lara Prescott is the author of The Secrets We Kept, an instant New York Times bestseller and a Hello Sunshine Reese Witherspoon book club pick. The Secrets We Kept is Lara's debut novel and will be translated, probably already has been translated in many of these languages, into over 30 languages and adapted for television by the Ink Factory and Marc Platt Productions. She received her MFA from the Michener Center for Writers at the University of Texas. She studied political science at American University in Washington, D.C., and international development in Namibia and South Africa. Prior to writing fiction, Lara worked as a political campaign consultant, which I could spend a whole hour talking to you about. Her writing has appeared in the Southern Review, the Hudson Review, Crazyhorse, and more. And she is an author living here in where I'm broadcasting from, Austin, Texas. So in the chat box, everybody, let's give it up and say a big yay, welcome. Thank you so much for being here and joining us.
Thanks for having me.
You're welcome. All right, James Wade is an award-winning fiction author with 20 short stories published in various literary journals and magazines. His debut novel, All Things Left Wild, was just released on June 16th of this year from Blackstone Publishing. James spent 5 years as a journalist before serving as a legislative director at the Texas State Capitol during the 83rd legislative session. He also worked as a lobbyist on behalf of water conservation in Texas. You guys kind of have the political overlap there too. And he lives here in Austin, Texas as well. Thank you so much. And has been a long time member of the Writers League of Texas, I'll also say. Thank you so much for being here, James.
Yes, ma'am. Happy to be here.
Glad to have you. Don't ever call me ma'am again. So let's get into it. When I think about historical fiction, I do, obviously that can encompass a really large spectrum of stories and time periods and all of the rest of it. And both of you have picked very different backdrops for the novels that we're really focusing on today. So I thought I'd give you each a chance to just, we have Book People, our independent bookstore here is our official bookstore for this event, and we are sending everybody to go pick up books from the authors and give them support by buying their books. But so for that reason, because I think they would really enjoy your novels, but also just to hear from you a little more about the setting, I'm going to give you each an opportunity to kind of give us the brief. Here's what this book is. And Lara, I'm going to start with you.
Sure, and I'll show you. So my book comes out on paperback this Tuesday. So
oh, you have an event, don't you? Will you plug your events? Because you have a virtual
I have an event at Book People with the wonderful Angie Kim this Tuesday as well. So the day my book comes out on paperback. And if you just go to Book People's website, I think it's at 7 p.m. but or my website, which is just my name, laraprescott.com. But yes, my book, The Secrets We Kept, it's inspired by the true story behind the publication of Dr. Zhivago. And what I mean by that is that Dr. Zhivago was written by Boris Pasternak, and it was banned in the Soviet Union for so-called subversive content. And Boris Pasternak handed his novel off to the Italians and smuggled it out of the country, who then went on to publish it in the West, which was very big no-no in the Soviet Union and could have meant the death of Boris Pasternak himself. And my story really deals with the CIA's secret mission to take this banned novel and smuggle it back behind the Iron Curtain for the citizens to read and to question why their government had banned it. And I first heard about this story in 2014. There was a Washington Post article about the CIA mission that had been a long time rumor, finally declared that it did happen, and they released about 100 documents on their website detailing this mission, which was named AE Dinosaur. And when I was reading about it, many of the names of the spies involved had been redacted. And so I was really inspired to kind of imagine what the officers' lives were like and fill in the blanks through fiction. So it goes back across the Washington, D.C. in the 1950s, the Soviet Union, and follows this book as it travels around the world. And I will say I mostly focused on women and their stories, the early spies of the CIA, and what their roles were during the Cold War, as well as Olga Ivanskaya, who was Boris Pasternak's real-life mistress and muse, who inspired the character Lara in Dr. Zhivago, which is what I was named after. So it's really an interesting story about how books were once used as a weapon and the power of literature.
It reminds me too a little bit that story of the new podcast that came out recently about the song that was used as propaganda, sort of unbeknownst to other, fans around the world. That's all I can. The winds of change. That's
what change. Yeah, the CIA had their hands in literature, music, and art for a very long time.
Yeah.
Where they've had their hand in the mix. But yeah, Zhivago was one of their big books that they worked.
It's such a cool story. It's such a fascinating story. And these two characters who are sort of plucked out of the steno pool, for lack of, from the CIA and sent out to get it done. So thank you very much. So James, can you give us now for something completely different, right? The turn of the century in the American Southwest.
Yeah, absolutely. And so Laura's paperback's coming out, but in case y'all want to get a hard copy of The Secrets We Kept, I've got it right there for everybody to see what it looks like. And then mine's right next to it. So there you go. Pick them both up at the same time. No, so for me, I've always loved historical fiction, not necessarily just because of the events surrounding it, but of the people that kind of get lost in the mix. And so what I wanted to do with All Things Left Wild was pick a time in our nation's history and kind of in world history where you had a lot of tumultuous things happening. You had the Mexican Revolution was kicking off in 1910. You had this kind of unprecedented expansion into the West, where Arizona and New Mexico were not yet states, they're still territories. And because of that kind of lack of cohesive law, certainly a lack of infrastructure, transportation infrastructure, you kind of had this whole section of our country that was just, completely different than everywhere else. So like if I were to tell you, oh, America, 1910, you would think East Coast, civilized, we have electricity and we have, we got our top hats and our canes, whatever. But in the Southwest, it was, and still is to a certain degree, just a little wilder out there. And so what I wanted to do was take some characters who were not historical characters, throw them in the mix of this time with all of these historical events happening, and see kind of how they react in terms of handling their own shit along with the historical stuff. So in other words, like, I just think about right now, we're in the midst of obviously a very crazy time, right? With a pandemic, with a much needed and hopefully revolutionary conversation on racial justice. And so all these things are going on right now. And while we're of course fighting the good fight against those things, we're also trying to raise our kids. We're trying to stay connected to family. We're trying to, live our lives at the same time. And so I think a lot of times that gets lost when you look at historical fiction, right? We get caught up in the Titanic and not in the relationships of the people on board, which, by the way, and I promise Laura is not paying me for this, but that's something that she does an excellent job of in The Secrets We Kept, is you don't care just about Dr. Zhivago and whether or not the CIA is going to, excel in their mission, but you care about the romantic relationships, you care about the paternal relationships. Like, she does a good job of taking the things that are not just historical, right? Because that's what I've always loved about historical fiction. You are reading about something that takes place in history, but you're connecting with these characters in ways that you're like, oh yeah, I've had anxiety about the purpose of living before. Hey, I could have been in 1910 too. And so that's kind of where All Things Left Wild is basically born from, was that idea. And so the elevator pitch is two brothers commit a horrible crime where someone's accidentally murdered. They go on the run, and the father of the murdered son, who knows nothing about life in the wild or how to exact his revenge, is kind of unwillingly forced to go after them and try to bring them to justice. And it's basically these characters just having to make a lot of moral decisions. There's a lot of inner turmoil. For Western fans, I say it's like a Western, except when the cowboys get off their horses, they have a lot of introspection. But yeah, anyway, you can pick it up at Book People. They've got some signed copies, I think, that are still available. If not, I'll be signing some more soon.
Awesome. So I love that that gives me a good jumping off point to my next question, which is, it does seem like historical fiction has to do two things sort of simultaneously, right? You have to not only craft a story, a relatable story with characters who are compelling and who we want to follow to the bitter end, but you also have to then bring to life this entire setting that is so different from our own in many ways. So whereas, contemporary fiction authors get off easy, how hard can it be? You just tell a story. Just kidding. You guys have to do this other big piece of heavy lifting. So I would love, and Lara, I'll go back to you to start to talk about that piece of it. I imagine, I'm just wondering, when you craft the story, how aware are you of those two things? And then what are some of the ways that you went about doing the latter, doing the historical era, it's giving it its due?
Yeah, it's an interesting occupation to take on a event in history and fictionalize it. I think for me, it all starts with the research, and the research has two purposes for me. One, to get it as close to right as I can, but also to start as a jumping off point. I do so much research so that I have these things in my head, and the characters then come out of that research. And my book deals with characters that are both fiction, totally fiction, like the women spies, Arena and Sally. And then I have people who really existed. And I have kind of a two-pronged attack for both of those. With the people who existed, I try to do as much primary research as possible from primary sources. And if I had quotes or firsthand accounts of these scenes that happened in history, I tried to use them and just imagine what was not written in letters or documented between these people. That was where I could have fun with fiction. With my totally fictional characters, I wanted to do as much research as I could about, what was it like to live in Washington, D.C. in the 50s? What was it like to be gay in the 50s? What was it like to be a spy, an early woman spy? So there's so many different places my mind can go to find a base point of what I need to start building that story. So the research started about a year before I even started putting pen to paper. And I just researched as much as I could about all of these topics. And it really, I'm not the type of writer who plots it out and this is exactly what's going to happen, especially with the fictional characters. I really was researching, and one, point of research would lead me to think, oh, this could happen between these characters, and it gives it a life of its own. But with the historical figures, I'm looking at the historical timeline and hitting those beats of what happens and making sure I get it as perfect as possible. And then there's so much that goes into the revision process of finding anachronisms and finding little things. And even in the paperback someone had emailed me something about whiteout. I had the secretaries using whiteout, which did exist, but it wasn't commercially used until like a year after I wrote. And so they emailed me a long letter. So it is fixed. So it's fixed in this one, but there's always things that you can miss because you really have to, try to do the work justice, and you're doing this research while at the same time crafting characters. So it's finding that balance. But I also feel strongly that if you get too in the weeds with the research, then the characters and everything kind of just feels dead inside. And why didn't you just write a nonfiction book? So there is a reason why you write fiction, and that is to have people be able to step in those people's shoes and think their thoughts and feel what they might have felt. And it's a very different type of thing than reading, the biography of Boris Pasternak.
I love that we can just always rely on fact checkers out in the world who will let us know. And that then you can publish a paperback and you fix the whiteout thing, and you're not, driving those 5 other readers out there crazy when they read your whiteout. line. So sticking with you for a second, because there have been a couple questions specific to that idea of writing about both real life characters and then fictional characters, and specifically a question that I hear often when we talk about historical fiction, and that is, do you need permission to write about historical figures, real life people in historical fiction? How would you answer that?
I think that it depends. I think if I was writing about people who were alive, I think I would think a little bit harder about, I don't know about getting permission, but kind of getting more of their input into the situation and seeing if I was doing it justice. But at the same time, I don't think if every historical fiction writer needed to get permission about every thing they're writing, then there probably wouldn't be any historical fiction, or you would be limiting yourself to people that were still alive and you couldn't go back 100 years. And I think that would be a real shame. I think you have to trust the writer to do the best that they can, but also recognize that this is fiction. This is not a biography that's been vetted by the family. And I think it's also important to think that, you know, getting permission, you know, their take of historical events might be very different than someone else looking into those historical events. And that's something I play around with in my book. You know, everyone thinks they know what happens, but from one person's perspective, it can be completely different. You know, people could see Olga Ivanskaya as, you know, Boris Pasternak's beautiful lover and muse, and other people may see her as a spy who betrayed Boris, or, you know, there's all different ways to look at history, and people who have a stake in that history as well.
Mm-hmm. We have a lot of love for your books happening in the chat box, by the way, to both of you. I love it. So James, how about you with that idea of balancing those two, being a storyteller and, you know, telling a compelling story, but then on top of that, bringing this moment in history to life?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, I blame Writers League of Texas for even having the idea out there that I write historical fiction, because I did the historical fiction manuscript contest back in 2016, and I put that on, you know, a lot of my early bios, and so I always have to explain, like, yes, this is a piece of fiction that takes place in history, but I don't want anybody to look at this like it's a textbook. Like, you know, like Laura was saying, you can get really bogged down in the idea of the genre, you know, and then you start to lose the narrative, or you start to lose, you know, the characters, especially in something like All Things Left Wild, where it's not based on, you know, Laura she had things that actually happened that she had to kind of, you know, stick to at least a little bit. And so I was kind of free to do whatever I wanted. And I have to, you know, remind folks of that it's historical fiction with an emphasis on the fiction, right? I wanted to create the landscape and the time period as best I could. Certainly the historical events I did reference and the historical figures I did reference, I wanted to get those accurate. But for the most part, I would, you know, if you look at the genres that this has been listed under, it's literary fiction, it's Western, it's historical fiction, it's coming of age, it's action adventure. I mean, you know, we get so bogged down in that stuff. And I think that folks who like to read about history are going to like a fiction book that is historical, no matter how close you get to that magic percent of what's true and what's not. You know, for, again, to piggyback off Laura about the anachronisms, I had one of my editors come to me and say, oh, you know, they wouldn't have said bullshit here. They would have, they didn't use that yet. They would have probably said, you know, the closest thing would have been like, horse malarkey, or I don't know, something that just sounded so cheesy. And I'm like, yeah, that character is supposed to be, you know, no, we're not going to do that. We're just put bullshit in there. It's okay. And so it's, you know, little narrative decisions like that that are, that take it make it a little less historical, but maybe make it a little more pleasurable to read. And and of course, all that being said, I was completely spoiled because all of my research was done at the actual places. My wife and I took like a 2-year road trip where we were living out of our 144 square foot travel trailer, and we were boondocking or free camping at all of this this government land all across the Southwest. And so I had historical markers, I had public libraries. The Santa Fe Public Library was so instrumental in my research. And not only that, but like the geography hasn't changed, right? If you're describing how New York City looked in 1910 versus now, then you're going to need to get some historical reference. But if you're describing what the Guadalupe Mountains look like, well, they look the same. They're still there. And so I was really spoiled because I would get up, every morning and walk outside the camper, and I would have the setting for whatever scene I was, about to write. And so it was fun, but I also was really, privileged and spoiled in that regard.
Well, and I think that I love hearing you say so much of what you just said, partly because I actually ran into you when you were in your camper,
That's
and
right.
Martha. We ran into each other, which was awesome and hilarious. But also that idea of, we've talked about this a few times during this unconference, that phrases like historical fiction are also marketing phrases, that they're
Yes,
meant to
absolutely.
help publishers figure out where books sit on shelves, that as readers, we're probably, I absolutely think there are readers who think, I love historical fiction, I'm going to find historical fiction. But I do think it shows that there's really a spectrum there, and that there are certainly folks who go to historical fiction and they want it to be absolutely 100%, accurate. They want the whiteout out of the book.
Right.
And then, there's also when you're talking, especially when you're talking, I think about the space of Western and sort of, thinking of a kind of a story that's not based on necessarily real life moments in history, but is more, it's set in that period because that period is what the story needs. Then it's a little bit different, right? But I do want to talk about that idea of the those anachronisms and those things that and Lara, I'd love to hear what your experience was. I know we talked about the whiteout, but sort of thinking about that, the way people spoke in the 1950s, or also dealing with just an entire part of the world that has changed so much, right, in the midst of the Cold War, versus for today's readers who might not know so much about that moment. How did you, like, in terms of feeling like the clothing, I imagine you think about things like clothing, you think about dialogue. Do you have specific places you would point our listeners to find some of that research that might be helpful to them?
Yeah, one of my favorite things to do for research was, and it kind of stumbled into this because I ordered all of these magazines like Time Magazine, Life Magazine, and other magazines that featured information about Boris Pasternak or reviewed Dr. Zhivago. And I'm like a real collector of historical artifacts. But, I ordered all these magazines and I'm reading the articles, and that was great research material. But what was really good research material is all the advertisements and the other articles, and talking about which type of cigarettes were advertised towards women in the 1950s, what types of underwear and dresses or whiskey, and just getting a feel for those things is really important. So I would say, try to get those historical artifacts if you can. On eBay is where I got a lot of that stuff. And then looking through archival photographs from the Library of Congress, or even archival mini documentaries, even if it's in silent, of what it felt like to be on the streetcar in Washington, D.C. in the 1950s. You can find so much stuff like that on the internet or through the library. One of the coolest things I've learned about through this research was you can find an expert in almost anything. And I stumbled on a fashion blog from the 1950s, particularly in Washington, D.C. And this woman who was obsessed with this very particular thing had this amazing research about it and put it all up of like, this is where you would go shopping in DC, and this is the kind of dresses you would get if you were higher class, or, if you were struggling to get the next paycheck, this is where you would shop. And there's these crazy websites like that all over the place that you can really almost fact check against it, and like, wow, they know more than some books out there. So there was a really good website about DC fashion that I found, and also Soviet fashion, which wasn't the same at all. And so I had really a lot of fun like hunting down those details. I think a lot of historical fiction writers feel the same way, where those bits and pieces that you pick up along the way as you write really feed you and get you passionate about the project, because writing a novel, you know, can take years, and your interest definitely, you know, ebbs and, you know, goes up and down throughout the process. And I feel like anytime I stumbled on, oh, this is what the inside of the Georgetown Theater in DC looked like, and this is the kind of candy they sold, it would just enter into my brain space and somehow make it into the novel, which was pretty cool. But yeah, I think starting with the librarians can help you find these obscure photographs or books that are out of print, and they can get them for you. It's absolutely the best resource you can have.
Yeah, librarians are a gift. And I think that a lot of them are so thrilled when someone comes in and says, I have something for you, figure this out for me. And then sticking just really quickly, because someone wants to know this from both of you. So I'm gonna ask you first, Lara. How long from start to finish, from research to, you know, writing the book? And I think you alluded to this already, but will you tell us what was that whole process from starting to when you actually, I don't know, let's say when it published, when it sat on the shelves?
Oh yeah, so 2014 is when I first got the idea for the novel, after I read that Washington Post article. And then I began doing a lot of research during that period, reading about CIA, Dr. Zhivago, all of these things. And then I actually moved in 2015. I moved here to Austin for my fellowship program at the Michener Center for Writers, which allowed me to quit my job and have writing be my full-time job. Otherwise, I think I would still be writing this novel. So, because I was, you know, only able to write when I wasn't working. So I think, like, I give so much thanks to the Michener Center for, you know, making that my job for 3 years. But it was my thesis while I was at the Michener Center. And so I wrote nonstop for those 3 years and sold the book in 2018. And then it came out, and then it went through a series of edits with my editor, and then it came out in September 2019. So about a 5-year process from idea to bookstore.
Yeah, yeah, and bestseller. Bestseller. Congratulations. Reese Witherspoon, how was that?
I mean, it was crazy. Yeah, it's definitely never thought I didn't even think anyone would be interested in reading my book. I didn't think it would sell or anything. So it's still a bit of a shocker. And when my editor told me Reese had picked it, I just, you know, I couldn't believe.
That's cool. James, how about you? What is the length of this process been for you, from sort of start of the germ of the idea to, you know, writing, working, history, research, and then to the publication?
So I actually wrote a few paragraphs before I did any research, because I didn't know I was writing a novel at the time. But we were in the camper. We were on Bureau of Land Management land in, I actually think I remember the day. I think it was March the 3rd, maybe, of 2018. And I had just gone on a little hike and was looking around. And I've told this story before, but I felt that the land was so uninhabited and so, you know, desolate, that I started to feel guilty because I could see my boot prints, you know, and I was like, oh man, something about this is wrong. I'm ruining this, you know, I shouldn't be here. And I like had this weird guilty feeling. And then this dust storm blew through, like right as I was thinking that, and it totally just, you know, took my boot prints and scattered them out somewhere else in the desert, and it looked like nobody had been there. And I kind of sort of had this epiphany of, well, of course other people have been here, you know, civilizations, Native Americans, you know, Spanish conquistadors, oilmen, cattlemen, all these people have been on this one piece of land. And at some point their, you know, we'll call it their boot prints, but like their stories have been kind of blown away. And so that's why I wanted to dive in and kind of tell a story about what it may have been like, you know, in that period of time, in that place. But that was March that I started writing. And then I kind of started doing the research and writing at the same time. March of 2018, I finished the novel. And again, we were on this trip. So kind of like Laura was saying, this was my full-time gig and I didn't have anything else to do. So I actually finished July 17th, July 27th, sometime mid to late July of the same year. I think we got an agent like Oh man, I don't know, like 4 days after I finished. It's not supposed to happen like that. But I took a really great How to Get an Agent class with Becca Oliver at the Writers League of
Oh
Texas.
boy.
I don't know if you've heard of her. But yeah, so we got an agent really quickly and then got a book deal really quickly after that. And then everything just kind of, I think we had the book deal by August of 2018 and the book came out 2 weeks ago. So
Yeah.
not even 2 weeks ago. So like, that's kind of the pace of the publishing industry, right? We had to do the contract negotiations and then the editing and the picking what goes on the front and that, just that whole thing. But yeah, but that's, I always caution people when they say like, well, how long did it take? It's all circumstantial. And so I was able to go to these historic places and these historic sites and get the info, straight from the horse's mouth. I had the time to do those things. My second manuscript took a lot longer than 5 months. So, it's all just circumstantial and kind of where you're at in your life and how the chips fall at that time.
Yeah. Yeah.